All right. All right, so welcome everyone. Composing History, Song and Oral Tradition in Rain. The title of this talk essentially encapsulates something that I'd like to propose to all of you, which is maybe a little bit coloring outside the box when it comes to both storytelling and the business of creating history. In the narrowest context, Rain is a literary challenge to Friedrich Hegel's white supremacist denial of the existence and historicity of African culture. The story is composed to explode the European myths of the Age of Discovery by juxtaposing its calcified mythology with stories of lived experience through oral tradition. Rain dramatizes the fluidly dynamic oral tradition of the peoples of Namlolwe, in counterpoint to the petrified rigidity of authorized monolithic history books through the lens of Maya's Dreamwalker experience, where all time is contemporaneous. So among the, as I go through this talk, I'd like to, sorry, here's my table of contents. There we go. I'd like to take you very, very quickly through a series of narrative elements in the story. I'm not going to be summarizing the story at all. And those of you who have read will understand why that would be a futile exercise, right? And I see Andrew nodding very, very vigorously. So rather than tell you what is happening in the book, what happens when, I'd like to rather share with you, maybe, pull back the curtain on the composer's workshop, on the poet's workshop, to give you a glimpse at how the sausage is made, how I got around the business of putting this story together. I will be mentioning, like I said earlier, musical elements as well as rhetorical elements. And in the afterword, I do specify where the most important influences are, including Dante's mode of poetic composition, his poetic voice, his focus on structure. And here, when I visited at a couple of the classes, I believe it was Douglas's class and Lewis's class, I talked about ekphrasis in Dante and in Virgil and in Homer. And so I get the chance now to talk about ekphrasis in Rain, which is going to be our entry into the story. I also want to present a few pointers about how the storytelling plays with semantic fields. And then I will look at specific rhetorical functions and how alliteration, anaphora, and rhythm help sort of develop that sense of immersion that is so essential to creating a phenomenological kind of storytelling. Because if Hegel's thesis about the ahistoricity and absence of culture in Africa is simply done by fiat, rather than argue with Hegel, rather than put out a scholarly treatise making the case for the obvious, I thought, well, why not simply just share what is actually there, and people can decide for themselves whether they agree with Hegel or not. One of the other elements that I'm going to be talking about is the modes of internal memory. I want to focus on two specific ones that I'll show you examples of, which is ring composition. Ring composition is a mode of storytelling that is very, very common in oral traditions across the world. Ring compositions tend to occur when a phrase or a scenario is presented at the beginning of an episode. The episode is developed with all its vicissitudes, and then the phrase or the element comes back at the end and essentially ties up that section of the narrative. So this is something which you will recognize as you read Rain occurs at a very focused, concentrated level, but also on a wider level. In fact, I would say that the entire story is structured as a ring composition. And then I also want to share a few elements. And in this section, I'm going to be running through a series of textual examples very quickly, because these verbal monuments that I want to present are essentially point to the way in which the monumentalization of history is not just represented in sculptures in stone and books, but also in the game of names. Um, uh, Another way in which we have verbal monuments in rain is the ritornello, the return, the refrain constantly coming back of the edicts of Pope Nicholas V, two of them, a papal bull called Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex, in which he essentially mandated the terroristic approach of the Age of Discovery to all the peoples of the world. And I hope that I have a little bit of time to share with you some details about scansion within the text, because the story is, after all, called A Song for All and None. And since I'm talking to a room of musicians, composers, performers, I thought that it would be interesting to see how textual scansion and musical rhythm work together. And without much further ado, let us begin. Uh, in in general terms, Rain is a multi-generational story. The family at the center covers about 6 generations, but goes beyond that. And this series, the two family lines that you get are joined here at the center by a young man who whose story gets told in the kind of ritornello that I was talking about earlier. All you ever hear about Ochieng, or not all, but most of what you ever hear about Ochieng is everybody's memory of his death, right? His death in Russia by himself affects his grandmother, his great grandmother, his cousin, and even his nieces and nephews in generations later. And the central character of our story this time is Maya Anyango, the dream walker of whom I spoke. Maya has some very special characteristics, which I think in what my friend Andrew might call post-enlightenment Eurocentric terms would be categorized as neurodivergent. Maya experiences the world in a way that is uh, anomalous when it comes to her sensory receptions. And this is a symptom of her ability to exist simultaneously across different moments in time. The story leads us through learning how she has to orient herself in this kind of multiplied instantiation of the present. And then we find that as she does that, she is connected with other dreamwalkers who also experience the world in this way. The generation of her siblings make up the the bulk of her contemporaries, but the most significant figure in the story is Mama Koth, the great grandmother of these children, the holder of memory and the educator, the nurturer of all the generations of Jokolo and Jokomolo. Let me see what else I want to tell you about this family before I move on. I think this works. Rain is the first in a series of 7 books. Rain, Wind, Sun, Web, Sound, Stone, and Seed. The way I've structured the books, I have all of the outlines completed, and now it's a matter of doing the work of the scribe, right? The scribe who sits down, and thankfully I don't have to use a quill and ink. I can just type um, and very patiently let the story unspool it as it goes. With each of these books, many of the same, well, essentially the same core characters occupy different roles in the Dreamwalker Canticles. In Rain, we see Maya occupy the role of the seeker. Olo, her great grandfather, and Akoth, her great grandmother, occupy the role of teacher. while the role of pilgrim in this particular story is occupied by Frei João de Souza, who's also known as Tejo of the Lioness Mountains. As you see in the structuring the stories, these roles then change over time across the different volumes. There's a special role in each of the volumes, which is love. You will notice that seeker, teacher, pilgrim tend to be active agents. Love, however, we tend to think of conceptually as just not so much an agent as an experience or a state, a sentiment, and what have you. The way I've wanted to explore love is in all those acceptations, and most specifically, love as a state of being, a state of grace. And so each one of the characters who essentially occupies or embodies the center of love in the story becomes the focus um, of the experience of love, the generation of love, the agency of love, the state of grace that it entails, and all of the loss and joy that comes with that. So Rain itself, oh, let me see, go back there. There we go. Rain itself is a book that is divided up into nine books. The volume is divided up into 9 books, and each of the books carries a theme with it. The first book, Olo, is a song of creation. This is where we encounter the creation myth of this culture that Hegel denies exists. The second book, Akot, is a song of memory. As I told you, Mama Akot is the holder of memory. And this takes you, once you enter into book 2, you find yourself in the world into which Mama Akot was born, a world that is pre-colonial. It is before, a world that existed before the advent of the British colonizers, before the Berlin Conference, which has also been dubbed the launch of the Scramble for Africa. And so you get to see a mode of living that has a natural rhythm to it, where all of the members of the families that live in these villages have their specific roles. The children have particular roles. Boys are herders, girls cultivate and harvest, women build, and men, well, they go fishing. And it's quite remarkable how universal that is, yes? Anyway, the third book, Alex and Maya, is a song of conception and birth. And this is where the generation that I mentioned earlier, the generation of the Maya and her siblings, we get the story of how each one of them was conceived to their parents, Gabriela and Anna. It's not a story that is devoid of pain and trauma. And I was talking with a friend of mine yesterday about how in the middle of the story, because especially in the medieval and very Thomistic conception of procreation, the idea is that sex is always related to procreation and generation. And so the Song of Conception and Birth is also a really great locus to examine a little bit some of the subtlety, some of the nuances of what surrounds this kind of Congress, both in terms of its positive experience and outcome, and also in terms of the traumas and pains and also modes of pathologization that come about in people's experiences. Book 4 is a song of betrayal. This book was incredibly difficult for me to write. It's very difficult for me to read. And it is, while there have been hints of violences along the way, this is the book where that violence explodes in an utterly unmitigated and senseless way. And it is specifically the Song of Betrayal because One of the things that I really appreciate having developed as a reader of the Commedia is a profound understanding of how much more ethically and psychologically and emotionally devastating betrayal can be when compared to violence for violence's sake, right? And so this brings the two together, um, and uh, and uh, and launches us into the moment, the catalyst that gives us an inside look into Maya's dream-walking state in Book 5, which is the Book of Nature. Book 5 is pastoral, it's bucolic, it's completely I would say completely peaceful, because we spend almost the entire time dream walking with Maya. We also spend a great deal of time getting to know the savanna grassland of the East African land where she comes from. And we get to meet Frei Jean de Souza for the first time proper. Uh, and and hear for the first time the echoes of that papal bull that will scatenare, that will catalyze the disaster of the colonizing enterprise. A Song of Love is, I think, easily my favorite. The Blood of Anatole Basile Tejo. It's curious, when Bridgerton came out, I was giggling, because one of the moments in the story of Anatole Basile Tejo is how his bride actually forgoes the London season, which was established based on Queen Charlotte's ball. And so I think Bridgerton plays with that a little bit. And I thought it was very funny, because the love story of Anatole Basile Tejo reads very much like I don't know, a Harlequin romance, at least to me. This is immediately followed by the Song of War. And this is where Vasco da Gama makes his presence known and felt. And as I said, rain is very much a phenomenological approach to storytelling. So the storytelling is composed in a way to evoke sensory experience. And here, the Song of War, as I have experienced and as I've heard other readers experience it, is not just traumatizing for the violence that it recounts, but for the feelings of nausea and hopelessness that it evokes. Finally, we get to the Book of Migration, where the children move out into the world, and we see their first sojourn away from Namlolwe. And the story ends with the Song of Time, which brings us full circle, as I said, to where we begin. Now, in telling all of these stories, like I said, this was supposed to be, or is supposed to be, and is created as a response to not just Hegel proper, but to a worldview that is, I beg your pardon? Oh, to a worldview that is unfamiliar with the vitality and beauty of the world of East Africa specifically, but this is an idea, a concept that can be applied to any place in the world, any culture that is not part of the hegemonic center, right, of our contemporary culture. So when I was, you know, composing this story, I knew that the most important voice was the voice of the Luo storyteller. The Luos are the people who live near Namlolwe, who've developed this, and this is who've developed the culture on its shores, and it is the cultural ethnic group of this family that we're talking about. And so in telling all of that, there's always a challenge. How do you tell a Lua story if you're going to tell it in English, right? How do you translate the oral tradition of a specific ethnic group that has no linguistic correlation to English into English. And the choice that I made was to make English sound the way Luo sounds, to construct the thoughts in this language in such a way that a native English speaker might stop and do a double take, right? Because it sounds like they're hearing not exactly an accent, but they're hearing an inflection that is not quite native, right? As you can tell, I'm a thoroughly assimilated Anglophone speaker. And so in order to do that, what I relied upon were the strains of my native language. And so I want to give you a little bit of taste of what Luo sounds like. I selected two passages to show you. And one of them is the beginning of the book of Genesis, but I think that it might be,
Chakruok.
it might be,
Zaburi
better,
Prariogadek.
excuse me. It might be more interesting to share with you the Psalm 23 in the Luo, the language of the Luo, because it's compact, it's complete. And if you will take a moment and just let the sound and the rhythm soak in. And if you know Psalm 23, maybe see if you can recognize some of what's being said. So here you go. Let's see if I can, there you go.
Zaburi Prariogadek. Ruoth Nyasaye Majakwath.
Is the sound coming through? Okay, good. Oh, look at that. There we go. Come on.
Zaburi Prariogadek. Ruoth Nyasaye Majakwath. Ruoth Nyasaye e jakwadha. Kuom mano, ok anyal chando gimoro. En ema omiyo anindo e lum mang'ich, kendo otera modho pi mokwe. Oduogo chunya, kendo otelona e yo makare, kaka nosesingore. Nyasacha, kata obedo ni akadho e hoho mar tipo mar tho, to ok analuor gimoro, nikech in koda. Ludhi gi odungani ema hoya. Iketo chiemo e nyima mana ka wasika duto neno. Irwaka gi ng'wono ka iwiro wiya gi mo, kendo ipong'o kikombena mi opiny. Adier, berni gi ng'wononi nobed koda ndalo duto mag ngimana, kendo nadag e odi nyaka chieng'.
The internet is a beautiful thing. You can hear the entire Bible in Doluo, right? And if you want to, you can even learn Doluo just simply by doing that. Having lived in America for so long and missing the language, the sound of home, very much the way Dante talks about missing the taste of bread, right? The taste of that saltless bread in Florence. I was delighted when I discovered a Bible app that included the entire text in both the Luo, which is my mother tongue. So this is how I sound when I'm not speaking in English in my head, and also Kiswahili, right? And what's really beautiful about it is much of the Bible, it's a lot of storytelling, obviously, and then there's also a lot of poetry. So I get to hear a lot of poetry and storytelling in Doluo and in Kiswahili when I have a chance. With that, when you have once you have a sense of how this sounds, the reader does a really beautiful job with the language here. And my job then, or my task then, was to try and tell this story in a way that would be that would give the readers a sense that they're in a world that is slightly different from the familiar English-speaking world that they know. And so with that, let me, as I pass through some of these, share with you the beginning of rain. As this text unfolds, I'd like you to, again, consider what elements in this story sound un-English, if I can put it that way. There's one of my early readers, an American, when I asked him what he thought about, when I asked him for feedback, he had a very interesting reaction. He said, you know, well, clearly, because I hadn't told him that I'd written it. I just asked him what he thought. He said, well, clearly, this sounds like it was written by someone who knows English very well, but it doesn't quite sound like English. Now, I'd be really, really interested in hearing what you all have to say. There's an animation that I prepared to go along with this. Why? Because like I said, this is an experiential reading. The first canto of Rain is almost entirely ekphrasis, right? Of an object that is going to be central to Maya's experience. And it's ekphrasis that's presented from Maya's perspective. So you're looking at this object through her eyes and experiencing it through her senses. So let's see. Let's hope this begins. Yes. The needle lay tremulously hovering over the compass rose, pointing at Maya's chest, even though she was facing north, holding the instrument parallel to the water below, the right side of her body, face, arm, leg, all awash in a cascade of the equatorial sun's morning rays. The cardinal points of the compass, carved into the brass an eternity before she was born, are impossibly delicate, and she wonders absently how human hands could etch with such subtle grace. 8 overlapping spearhead arrows radiate from the center of the rose, the clear half of each arrow polished smooth, the adorned half pierced and engraved from base to point, ornate with minute paisley curls, vines, mountain juniper berries, cones, and leaves. In the quadrants of the turntable between the cardinal compass points, gossamer strokes unveil billowing clouds with wide open eyes, frowning eyes, laughing eyes, full round cheeks and lips pursed, all blowing relentless winds into turgid sails of hardy ships on open seas, where whales' tails skim the surface and tentacles from the deep curl above the water, then sink down below, swooping upwards and outwards, tapering off where they just brush the edge of the eastern point, shielding part of the sun. Maya watches the pattern under the rose, listening to the brassy sunlight bounce into the carved metal, tinsel shreds of Ching's halo floating on the water all around, glinting, shimmering, almost shining in their muted collision with the surface of the lake. Nearby, a family of hippos ambles along, the smallest calf trotting behind his mother's stately gait. A red-breasted gonolek whistles, punctuating the air, and a herd of Lake Island elephants emerges from the brush to wade into the shore. Sacred ibis and cattle egrets are lighting on their backs. The crystalline waters of Namlolwe glimmer gently, blending sun and sound around Maya's drifting vessel at the center of the earth. So the first canto locates us at the center of Maya's universe, on the surface of the lake, on water, which becomes the principal representation of her fluid and dynamic experience of time and history. This is immediately contrasted in Canto 2, when she realizes that she's in Lisbon, standing on the marble Mapamundi behind the Monument of Discoveries. The marble Mapamundi, which incidentally was a gift to Portugal by the government of South Africa in 1960, is this enormous stone structure behind, here, if you want to get a sense of the scale, This is one of the visitors from an aerial photograph. And let's see. And it stands behind the Padrão dos Descobrimentos, which is the monument of discoveries that is described in Canto 2. Here's where we get into the idea of using semantic clues to paint a picture, an experience that contrasts Maya's fluid, lived history and the petrified, calcified notion that is celebrated by the Hegels of the world. So the keywords here are limestone, pavement, stone, marble, carved stone, monument, stone, cement. The white limestone of the pavement's mosaic oceans and compass bed rows is where she finds herself, and with her feet anchored on that map after having been floating on the lake. The lake water is gone, turned to stone at her feet. The world lay before her, framed in windrows of black, red, and beige marble, decorating the ground behind the carved stone crowd of earnest navigators, missionaries, monarchs, artists, scientists, explorers, and cartographers, all gazing out across the waters of the river Tagus, their backs turned to the scattering of tourists whose presence at the Monument of Discoveries pays living tribute to feats of heedless obtrusions into the homes of unsuspecting peoples across the world. To Alex, these stone figures, acolytes of the revered Infante Don Enrique, were all paragons of the age of exploration. Among them, Vasco da Gama was his peerless hero. Maya's squinting gaze settles momentarily on the surging prow of the giant cement caravel on which the straining statue stood. And a few images of that. This is you can find this on Wikipedia. Internet is a beautiful place. Where you have the prow of the ship has all of these cartographers, explorers, navigators, including Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, Afonso Quinto, and I think down here somewhere, Bartolomeu Dias, who we end up talking about. I believe this is him right here. And on the other side of the caravel, on the other side, here's again Henry o Navigador for reference. We have Luís Vaz de Camões, the poet who sings the history of Vasco da Gama as the hero of the Lusitanian history. As Maya remembers where she is, now she remembers visiting the tomb of Vasco da Gama, the stone sculpture where Alex said the admiral's bones are buried. Again, the verbal recollections of the sort of petrified glory of Portugal keep returning. Was in the cathedral. Now she remembered the cathedral, Santa Maria de Belém and the Mosteiro de Jerónimo. She remembered Alex talking for weeks of nothing but the commander of the São Gabriel, o peito lusitano que unituna Marte obedeceram, strains of Camões, weaving in and out of his extravagant panegyric, melding the poet's voice and the boy's voice in a history that made a visitor's memorial tomb inevitable. The mariner's marble figure, draped in petrified silks and velvets, pious eternity veiling his eyes, his closed eyes, and clasping his praying hands, lay supine just above the visitor's line of sight on an ornate platform, bearing emblems of his creed and trade, an armillary sphere, a carrack in full sail, and the square cross of the Military Order of Christ, sanctuary to the persecuted Knights Templar under the protection of Portugal's poet king. Subdued sunlight illuminates the mariner's reposing statue, softening the fold of his robe and the opulence of his beard, favored by fortune to be forever celebrated by touring shutterbugs. Vasco da Gama lies immobile in prayer, his work in the world complete, his soul at rest in peace. And here we have the cross of the Order of Jesus Christ, the carracks in full sail, the armillary sphere, and here Vasco da Gama looking as grand and peaceful as you like. On the other side of the cathedral, across the aisle, dormant in his own quietude, the poet Luís Vaz de Camões, the Lusitanian singer of arms and knights of Mombasa, Malindi, Zanzibar, Calicut, and Cananora, whose quill paints da Gama's voyages to those corners of the world as the most noble, divinely decreed performance of Lusitanian valor, also lies in eternal repose, palms touching and pointing heavenward. There we go. There's Camões. I want to show you the image before I go back to the text. A child could be forgiven for thinking him the soldier and sailor, believing da Gama the writer of verse. For where da Gama is draped in sumptuous robes, his head covered in velvet, Camões, stocking legs notwithstanding, carries a sword even in stasis, his head bare, and his wounded hollow eye winking at the heavens. Soldier though he had been, it is as poet that he makes his mark on the world. His song of da Gama's illustrious Lusitanian breast, whose will even Neptune and Mars obeyed, echoing in Maya's ear, as if rising from the muffled shuffles of seeking, wandering, tired, curious, lost pilgrim tourists, streaming by his limestone feet. Maya shuffles along the circling stream, trying to eavesdrop on a German tour guide who is herding a group into the church toward the sleeping poet across the aisle. Maya shifted closer to a stone column to avoid the swelling stream of tourists, craning their necks to look across the aisle at the winking face of Camões, quiescent in armed prayer. Then she joined the shifting crowd and Alex fell in beside her, both of them melting easily into the wave of shuffling visitors approaching the poet's memorial sepulchre, as armas e os barões assinalados. Where da Gama lay on a tomb that bore carracks and crosses and armillary spheres, Camões rested on an altar adorned with the poet's lyre and laurel wreaths, Phoebus himself clearly his intercessor to the heavens. And I believe you can, oh, sorry, there we go. This is really quite fascinating to me. When I saw this, the first time I visited the Catedral de Santa Maria de Belém, I was really quite fascinated by these two monuments. And at the time, I was in a state of mind that's very similar to Alex's, if you've read the book. So my admiration and veneration were quite florid at the time. Cantando espalhei por toda parte. As she circled around him, Maya could only just make out the sunken void of his missing eye that had been blinded in battle. Se tanto me ajudar o engenho e arte. Was it the soldier in Camões that made him turn his blind eye to the deeds of Vasco da Gama that Alex could not even find in the history books he read? What use were art and genius if they could not champion conscience? What use were art and genius? Now, this point, this is where Canto 2 ends. And this is where I believe all of the themes that are going to be developed in Rain have been stated in one way or another. Now it is about the introduction of characters and the details of the vicissitudes of their lives. For me, the question, what use are art and genius, is a question that I've asked for a long time. And I know that there are people here who've been with me in my my journey of, I guess, intellectual development for a very long time. And they are familiar with me asking these questions, always asking myself, what is the point of cultivating the disciplines that we cultivate? What is the point of so much reading? What is the point of so much effort? What is the point of even the acclaim that we seek for the works that we do? And so in writing Rain, in composing Rain, I was very conscious of trying to apply, at the very, very least, the art, the craft, and the labor. Even if the genius were lacking, at least be conscientious about telling the story in a way that was responsible to the subjects, that was responsible to the protagonists, and in a way that also made use of all of the elements that I myself have acquired and cultivated in my education from childhood. Among them is learning the histories of the age of discovery. Oh, I beg your pardon. Here we go, where we are taught that by the time Vasco da Gama and company were skirting the Capes, their minds set on silk and spices and sometimes immortality, compasses were complex machines calibrated in myriad ways. When Bartolomeo Diaz escaped the stormy southern seas and then got past another cape, Portuguese prospectors knew that the gods had smiled upon them, and theirs was not, after all, a lost cause. They could one day return home, their cargo bays filled with cloth and cloves and captive souls, with poets just waiting to sing their resonant praise and smoothen the rough-hewn edges of history. They would also enjoy a measure of immortality worthy of the stones that bore their likeness. The passages that I'm presenting not only point to the nature of the education that we received about the age of discovery, casting it as intrepid enterprises of entrepreneurship and exploration and discovery. I wanted to emphasize this particular case. This is a case where in this venue that we are, I wanted to show you one of the examples of ring composition that begins to start showing up in the story. In this particular case, it has to do with, first of all, articulating their ambition, right? And then articulating the reality of how that ambition is realized. Their minds are set on silk and spice and sometimes immortality. And when they come back with cargo bays filled with cloth and cloves and captive souls, right? So ambition and reality. Also compositionally, right? Using specific rhetorical elements to hold the two sections together. They're pages apart because the interim text runs for several pages as Alex teaches Maya about the grandeur of Portuguese explorers. So holding the two together in ring composition is this these phonemes comp ka ka no comp ka comp comp ka here, company, capes, compass, complex, calibrated, right? Comp ka comp comp ka, and then later reclaiming the ka, but now closing it with a clo, right? Where you have cape, which is bringing us from here, right? Cargo, cloth, clothes, and captive. So you have ka, clo, ka. And it's a very subtle thing. This is not the sort of thing that I think any writer really expects a reader to notice or catch. But the function, right, the rhetorical and musical function is to create a sense of structural harmony, right, within the flow of the narrative. Another example of using rhythm in ring composition is, I beg your pardon, is here when we enter into the love story of Anatole Basile Tejo in book 6, right? To give you just some context before I go into this example so that you have a sense of why I include this example, Anatole Basile Tejo is an incredibly cultured doctor who lives in Paris with his family when we first meet him. He's married, he has children, he's originally from Sierra Leone, and we'll get a chance to read a little bit about how he became who he became. His erudition begins in Sierra Leone when his father enrolls him in a French missionary school because his father's ambition is to turn his son into a French gentleman. This is where Rain highlights the difference between the purpose of education in French colonies versus the purpose of education in British colonies. British colonies were purely utilitarian in the education they provided. They wanted a competent workforce, and so they offered the bare minimum when possible. Whereas the French ideal for education was to transform the natives, civilize them into becoming French. And so Anatole Basile Tejo embodies this, and his story is told in, I think, like I said earlier, in very sort of Harlequin romance notes, as it were. And it begins because Anatole in his education, he reads a great deal. He reads a lot of poetry, he reads a lot of literature, the classics, Greek, Latin literature, the Bible, all kinds of patristic literature, as well as Francophone literature and Anglophone literature. His world, his psychological universe, his intellectual universe is saturated with the language of poetry. And so now the question then comes, now are these intentional choices that I'm making? Am I purposely deciding, oh, you know, now I'm going to write like this? I don't know. I think much of it is, as with musical composition, you follow the flow and then you bring to bear the technical tools necessary to more clearly articulate or formulate the aesthetic that you're trying to accomplish. So the song of Anatole Basile Tejo, the book begins, 9-year-old Nato did not like his name. And here you have a graphic representation of that rhythm, this dun 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 dun, right? His courtship happens in with a melding of sonnets and silence when he meets Marie. They talk a great deal about literature, and their legacy ultimately is to create a library in Bont. So the way his story begins reflects that. And later, when we talk about his name, you also get to see how that same motif, dun 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 dun, is slightly altered when it is in the peremptory voice of his father calling him. Instead of dun 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 dun, you have dun 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 dun, right? And so in this passage, 9-year-old Nato did not like his name. It sounded like an old-fashioned dandy's name, of the sort who walked around in waistcoats and top hats and monocles, a pocket watch tucked away at the end of a silver fob, a walking stick in one hand and a cigar in the other. At least that is what he envisioned whenever the English teacher in primary school called him when taking attendance, Anatole Basile Tejo. And then later, when you turn the page, other than his teacher, nobody really called him Anatole, or Basile for that matter. Only his father, the man who had chosen that embarrassing name. When his mother, where his mother trilled Nadu when he was in trouble, his father bellowed in dactylic tetrameter, the duality of the second and third names making them sound trochaic. Anatole, Basile, Tejo. Another example of ring composition comes in when years later, Anatole is in Paris after 10 years of education at the French missionary school in Sierra Leone. He goes to Paris for an internship, and there, this is what happens. He's at a party, a Christmas party, where all the young Africans who have been brought into Paris to be educated are being introduced to their mentors. His intellect, clearly incandescent, cast his strikingly sculpted visage and statuesque composer in such dazzling light that all who beheld or stood around him glowed from simply reflecting his splendor. Now, if that's not Harlequin romance, I don't know what is. And Marie d'Acourt-l'Évêque marveled that such an enchanting creature could be. We hear the story of Marie d'Acourt-l'Évêque. We hear the story of the courtship. And at the end, Marie d'Acourt-l'Évêque was enchanted that such a marvelous creature could be. This is an example where you have a ring composition that mirrors. She marveled that enchanting creature could be. Now she was enchanted that such a marvelous creature could be. And he, in turn, was no less charmed. Their mutual feeling found expression in conversations cobbled together from fragments of sonnets and silence. They did not leave each other's side from the moment they met until the evening's end, and when the sun rose the following day, they met again on the banks of the river Seine. All day they walked side by side, never once touching, not even their hands, but telling each other the stories of their families and their lives. Marie told Anatole Basile, but that is the name he told her to call him. 10 years have gone by, and now he likes his name. About what the war had been like. This, like I said, is one of the central love stories in book 6, The Blood of Anatole Basile Tejo. There's another love story in the same one, a generation later. And this one is a story between Maya's youngest sister, her baby sister, Hera, and Solomon, the young man that she meets when she goes to visit family or distant family in London. Once again, ring composition contains their story. And in this particular case, I'm going to take the liberty of reading the scene in its entirety, because I think it's worth, since I have the highlighted sections already up here for you, I think it'll be worthwhile to see how the ring composition holds it together. To set the scene, they're in Canterbury Cathedral, and they've been looking at the monuments, including one of the Black Prince. I think it was Henry II. I don't remember what Henry he was. There's an inscription around his tomb in Old French, and Hera has been reading it, and the inscription talks about how the prince is lamenting the fact that when he was alive, he paid no heed to the problems of mortality, but now he's nothing but desiccated and decaying flesh in that tomb of stone. Solomon followed Hera down the length of the cathedral, through the nave and the choir, past the sanctuary of the church elders, and finally into the chapel of the Trinity, where saints and a king and the slain archbishop were all enshrined in caged monument. The archbishop in question here is Thomas à Becket, I believe, right? It was difficult for Hera not to let such dour reflections, as she's reading this inscription, assail her closely held memories of Mama Kot's final days at the twilight of her life in the world of time. Hera could almost hear the beloved voice of water telling her, with its last fragile breath, to go forth into the world unafraid and dare to discover the stories of peoples in faraway lands. If you recall, I had mentioned that Hera is the one who occupies the space of love in this volume in Ring. Continuing. Standing apart and listening to Hera while she read under her breath, Solomon just watched, intent and absorbed. This was perhaps the moment when he would point to, if ever asked, when he could no longer see himself as something separate from her, or her as something separate from him. There was no flash of light, no thunderclap, just a sense that all was well with the world. When Hera had finished reading and contemplating the prince's posthumous prayer, Solomon followed her back across the sanctuary and the choir, and together they caught a fleeting glimpse of the fanning vaults of the central tower, high and remote, as if meant to be secret. They continued down the nave, drawn to the oddly ornate baptismal font set on the back of the gospel evangelists. There Hera and Solomon sat down in silence and waited for the evensong service to begin. Canterbury Cathedral was far less elaborate, with a kind of filigreed vaults and prismatically radiant stained glass that graced the almost diaphanous Westminster Abbey. The stout clustered columns of Canterbury, rising upward, spread their branches out into spare vaults that bespoke a humility unknown to Westminster's prettily bundled pillars, tiered and slender above, their fingers stretched to touch tips at the apex of the vaulted ceiling of the nave, drawing the visitor's eye heavenward to the greater glory of God. The columns evoked visions of a standing forest of stone, and the murmur and shuffle of conversations and feet mingled to make the same forest sounds as in nature in both houses of worship, as if the unguarded noise of living things in creation were simply the true language of heaven. Here too, at Canterbury, art song rose through the rustling gurgle of tourists milling around the cathedral. The stone vaults of the church ceiling smoothed out the keen edges of children's voices intoning the opening prayer, first in unison, and then, with dilating time, in a gradual cascade of overlapping harmonies, each vowel drawn, unhurried, speaking surely the language of saints. At that moment, Hera's thoughts grew even more saturated with her memories of Mamako, the silence that now filled the space that she had left bereft, with the passing out of the world of time, feeling even more profound. Mama Koth would love this, she thought, and Esther too, and Maya. Hera found herself imagining how the resonant sounds of the choral evensong might look to her afflicted sister's uncommon eye. She herself heard only music, and felt the sea of her soul swell and overflow with tears that sprang forth unbidden in a wave that was joy and saudade combined. With each turn of harmony, the tide surged within, and soon Hera just let herself weep without making a sound, unmindful of dissembling. Beside her, Solomon felt the heat rise from her brimming heart, and just as he had collected her words with shining eyes, he collected her silence as well, placing the palm of his right hand on the back of her neck with weightless tenderness. This was the moment that Hera would point to if ever asked, when she could no longer see herself as something separate from Solomon, or him as something separate from her. And so they sat alone for a while after the final tones of the evensong had vanished into the vaulted ceiling, Solomon's arm moving to circle Hera's shoulder and holding her close, Hera letting his serenity settle all her unspoken disquiet. And so with these examples of ring compositions, my hope is that as you read Rain, or as you reread Rain, as you contemplate Rain, you get a taste, right, of the kinds of storytelling attitudes that I grew up hearing my great-grandmother use whenever she told us stories, whenever she related a story that we'd heard 100 times, but every single time sounded new, even when she told it exactly the same way. I'm going to turn my attention now to a place of immense beauty, and I think I have a few spaces to go here that takes us, there you go, to the mountain of God's repose. This is the central mountain, Mount Kenya, in East Africa. There's also Mount Kilimanjaro slightly further south, and the way the story is told, the appearance of Mount Kenya, the focus on Mount Kenya is placed at the center of Rain, at the center of the entire narrative, because also of the centrality of the mountain itself, right? The centrality of the main themes. On the mountain of God's repose, directly beneath the equator, 3 peaks awaken to the manifold histories carried to them by clouds from every place in the world that is touched by rain. Their glaciers holding each account precious, each one a treasure of memory that finds its way slowly in the flowing melt of warmer days, into springs and streams and rivers that bear tidings from the red clay foothills of the equatorial mountain range along meandering courses flowing north and then east, and then finally south across the sprawling grasslands of the savanna to meet the ocean coast. Complementing that, after having presented the picture of the mountain of God's repose, Mount Kenya, the narrative goes into description of the savanna grasslands. This is a beautiful photograph, and I like it specifically because it features these beautiful giraffes. And once the narrative in Canto 32, which, like I said, is the central canto, draws to a close, the focus then spreads out, following the flow of the water from the top of the mountain, and now takes us through the savanna grasslands where all the animals congregate. When giraffes visit the waterholes, the hippos and the egrets and other small waders clear the way for them, mindful perhaps of how far down the giraffe must reach for even a small sip of water. Gazelles too, and impalas, often gather in small groups hiding in the tall grasses, but the wildebeest prefer mighty congregations, especially in the seasons of migration. Other grazing herds of unnumbered medley, and the great cats that live among them, all gather round shared waterholes and river lakelets. It is not unusual to find them all together at the waterholes along avian hosts like the ibis and the egrets, who keep pace in council with elephants, surely the grandest of these lords of the savannah. Deliberate and communal, the ways of these colossal beasts manifest an age-old love abiding for the waters brought to them by rivers, brought to them by rains. They roll in mud and splash and tread and dawdle away hot afternoons in the grassland pools, ponds, lakes, young and old alike, unmindful of the water snakes that slumber in the reeds and grasses all along the banks. The lion prides that sometimes come to share the watering holes, or maybe even envious of these insouciant giants, or maybe just bewildered by their love for mud and water. All these creatures, great and small, drink in all creation's tales, carried in the falling rain sent by heaven's eye, or gathered in the waters of the rivers that traverse their lands, and empty out to sea, to oceans that embrace the sky. At this point, I want to draw attention to that last sentence, all these creatures. One of the habits that I picked up from Dante is this focused, very meticulous attention to quantitative structural elements. Canto 32, like I said, is thematically central, it's physically central. And in writing this last sentence that encompasses all of the creation that I've been looking at, I found that writing a sentence that rhythmically reflected its position was the closest that I could come to at least paying homage to this impulse that I had to make use of some of the techniques that Dante uses. And so you have, as you read the sentence, right, you'll find that there are a total of 63 syllables, right, with a couple of silent beats after I, for example. And of the 63 syllables, these then divide up into each of first 32 and then 32 with the missing one at the end. So someone conducting might go something like, all these creatures, great and small, drink in all creation's tales, carried in the falling rain, sent by heaven's eye, or gathered in the waters of the rivers that traverse their lands and empty out to sea and to oceans that embrace the sky. So I is the half point and sky is the end of this. And this is the conclusion of the middle canto of the entire poem. So with that, I'm about to pivot after all of this love and all of this bucolic and wild beauty. I'm about to pivot into a section that I'm going to try and go by fairly quickly, simply because it is the repository of a great deal of violence. I will show you the first example, and then we'll go from there. When in book 4, we first meet João de Souza, the narrative voice we hear is in the first person. You'll notice in Rain, the general narrative is in the third person, and the first person voice only applies in narrative to the Portuguese chroniclers or to European historians. This was a very intentional choice. Partly, like I said, because of the way I wanted to respond to Hegel and that Hegelian notion of the absence of subjectivity, I just thought to simply push it to the extreme, right? And focus on the subjectivity of the European narrative voice, right? Which presents things in the I perspective, right? First person perspective. So this is from the voice of one of the scribes who's traveling with Vasco da Gama. We, the children of Lusus. Lusus is a demigod who was known to be a companion of Bacchus, right? We, the children of Lusus, descended of God's own companion, the god of wine and madness divine. We long ago received the sacred decree from the key bearer of the heavenly kingdom and vicar of Jesus Christ, His Holiness Nicholas Quint, to venture into the briny seas and fulfill our destiny. It falls upon us, the Holy Father decrees from the Holy See, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, so that His Majesty the King may most justly and lawfully, by his authority, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and appropriate to himself and his successor the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and our use and profit, to the greater glory of God and faith in the universal church. Thus, solemnly charge, so forth we solemnly go. This charge is repeated multiple times. We just saw it in Canto 30, again in Canto 33, where combined with this, what I call the name of games, where you have European monarchs, pontiffs, and what have you, loaded down with these weighty titles. The King of Portugal and all of the Spanish kings of Castile and Aragon, of Naples and Sicily and Sardinia, the great-grandson of Her Majesty, Queen Isabella, and His Majesty, King Fernando, the venerable and prudent, most bureaucratic Felipe II, had called upon Giovanni Battista of Cairati, near Milan, for His Majesty was also the Duke of Milan, in the name of the crown and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to render service to that most exigent of mandates issued 110 five-fold years since by the Holy Father in Rome, to His Majesty Don Afonso and the Lusitanian crown, that the Lusitanian crown invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and thereby enable His Majesty the King to most justly and lawfully, by his authority, reduce the persons to perpetual slavery and appropriate to himself and his successors in kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit to the great glory of God with faith in the universal church. Now this reiteration, this ritornello, back to the Pope's decree, what you see italicized is a direct quotation from the papal bull, Dum Diversas, that is then repeated in Romanus Pontifex. The storytelling purpose of this is to reiterate the way repetition normalizes and renders as inevitable truth a mere declaration by fiat, right? And so to examine what it is that propelled and emboldened these European sailors and merchants and soldiers to go out into the world, what I found in the Composition of Rain is this particular document and other resonant documents that reiterated, repeated, or expanded the scope of its power, all the way past Vasco da Gama's generation, as we saw, even 100 years after when Port Jesus was being built, and all the way up to the 19th century colonial enterprise that had as its centerpiece the scramble for Africa. Naturally, England is present. And the most redoubtable Otto Edward Leopold, Prince of Bismarck, Duke of Lauenburg, Chancellor of North German Confederation, and the Minister President of Prussia convenes a conference in Berlin to sort out the most potent ways that the children of Europa will use to crush the backbone of Africa. Again, the name of games. For 13 weeks and 14 days, 15 nations gather round. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, along with the United States, to carve up the African continent for themselves, unbeknownst to their prey. They will obliterate all the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, and dominions in Africa, appropriating to themselves and to their future heirs all the rivers of diamonds and rubber and gold that flow through the heart of the land. They will convert African goods and possessions to their own use and profit, to cobble together empires to rival Caesar's Rome, and maybe even the kingdom of God. Why let such a paradise go to waste, go unexploited, undevastated, especially when there's wealth to accrue, cathedrals and churches to polish and paint, palaces to build, and jeweled tiaras to craft to queens and princesses alike? Eden was never meant to remain untouched by the grabbing hand of man. He must ravage and squeeze it and bleed it and turn all its life into mortar and stone, monuments to dead sailors and kings. Thus is the will of the Lord our God. Invade, search out, conquer, capture, vanquish, and subdue all the souls of the world. Reduce the persons to slavery and take all their kingdoms and smash them to dust. Show them the living hell on earth and teach them to pray for our mercy and the salvation that comes with paying with blood for the greater glory of God and faith in the universal church or just an international bank. It would be a shame and surely impious to let all that paradise go to waste. Sons of Italia, brava gente, make the entrance into the game. Abyssinia, their singular aim. How better to raise the old glory of Rome than to conquer the lands of the Queen of Sheba, the land of the children of Solomon? But the warring sons of Italia cannot make Abyssinia submit. So instead, they engage in chattel trade with fathers of daughters, of babies not yet maidens, and these children, the sons of Italia, confined to their harems for service, both carnal and menial, gifting and trading these girls as they please, because after all, that's how it's done. Caesar and Mark Antony both took pleasure in Queen Cleopatra's bed. These sons of Italia, the infant daughters of Abyssinia, instead. The royal houses and the merchant companies confer to normalize and globalize the horrors of their fortunes. But the silent spaces in Alex's history books remain thickly impenetrable to poetry's truth. All that he can see are the words and the dates, but none of the tragedies of shattered lives and scattered dreams veiled and buried underneath all the empty spaces in the lines of those history books. Nor can he hear in the names and titles, the clanging clash of colonizers slipping past memory's glare. The histories that Alex reads are fairy tales that where empires strike a dulcet tone, and all the natives strain like infant birds awaiting love and guidance from imperial masters weaned at Europa's bosom. All that Alex learns from his father's history books is a ritual acclamation for the conqueror's campaign. What he does not hear and what he does not see in the quiet empty spaces twixt the letters and the lines is a wretchedness and woe that the conqueror begets in every corner of creation, all in the name of God, in the name of glory, and if only truth be told, in the name of gold. This brings me to the end of representation, not only of history, but also of ring cycles. I'd like to, if we have the time, to share one last example of the musical elements of this. One is triplets in an aphra, where after looking at the legacy of the colonial legacy, and we find ourselves post-independence, this is a passage that now finds that the neo-colonial, post-colonial authorities are equally responsible for the situation in which the land finds itself. And so the passage here you'll find, if I can make myself some room here, in every corner of the world, again, I tried to arrange this so that you could see the rhythmic relationships with the focus and attention on these triplets here, right, which appear in an aphra. In every corner of the world, protectorates and colonies, both the current and the late, all let the prefect nations siphon off their natural wealth to build themselves inscrutable thrones with all the stolen bounty. Nobody wonders if it is a joke that all the most richly endowed by nature have to beg for scraps to feed their children day by day. Nobody wonders if it is a joke that all the desperate destitute learn to never question the magnanimous benevolence of missionary nations who have turned them into beggars for the bounty of the land, bequeathed to them by heaven's grace. Nobody wonders if it is a joke that local native prefects make the most effective agents of the empire's control. And so again, the rhythm is purposefully insistent with these moments of, rhythmic variation when the anaphora comes into place, because the anaphora, nobody wonders if it is a joke, is turning on the idea that the situation is quite dire and absolutely ridiculous, and yet it doesn't get called out, it doesn't get mentioned. The other example of rhythmically intentional use is the description of the situation right after independence. This is at the end of the siege of Mombasa, or describing the moment where the sieges of Mombasa end with the independence of Kenya. And here, again, I have once again rearranged the text. It starts out in 1963 and then comes with time bereft of rain. I'm going to read the scansion and show it to you as I read it. And I'd like you to notice what the rhythm is doing and how it's doing it. All right. So here's our pickup beat. If you can imagine that each one of these, it's actually 2 lines would equal a measure, right? Of something like 8/4, if you will, right? So we actually have 7 measures: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Why 7, not 14? The enjambement here completely and touches a C across, makes it necessary to hold those lines together. And so here's the sound, follow me, of the passage, you will hear again those triplets occurring in the anaphora, and the triplet is also occurring in places of particular attention, right? In 1963, the seizures of Mombasa, all of which had started with the harrowing of Kilwa, came to an end at last in a world that had by then completely changed in nature. For though the Portuguese and the Turks and the Sultans and the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha Queen no longer held dominion over any coastal city, no over the fort of Jesus Christ, no over the river that touches the sea, across savannah grasslands from the equatorial mountain to the Rift Valley's edge, nor the great lake streams that feed the river Nile itself. The land was racked with woe. Its air somehow mixed with the poison fumes of Lethe, its unrecorded histories, desiccated vapors, and the dead, unmoving winds of a time bereft of rain, right? So the rhythm is purposely created in a way to pay attention. If you have any composers in the audience, you know that you can alter the natural rhythm of language, but you can also insert certain caesura, if you like, pauses to emphasize things. And this happens toward the end, especially where you have measures that contain single words: unrecorded histories desiccated, dead unmoving winds, and then rain at the end, okay? And so with that, I come to the end with a small nod, utterly inadequate nod, to one of my literary heroes, who is Toni Morrison. I wrote Rain because I wanted to continue hearing the kinds of stories and the way the stories were told that I grew up hearing with my great-grandmother. My education saturated me with the poetics of some of the finest storytellers that I have known. And so, following Toni Morrison's advice, if there's a book you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And this is what I did. So thank you all very much for your attention. And I appreciate all of you who have stayed, and I would love to welcome you to ask any questions that you might have, make comments, responses. Thank you.